Now they say the third time's the charm, so remember what I told you when we started the other two sessions? Cell phones, okay? All right? Third time's the charm. We're going to start this afternoon. We've got Miss Kelly Mercier, who's a graduate student at Virginia Tech, and one of Dr. Coit's slaves. One of his students. And the last several years, VFGC has helped to sponsor Ecology of Grazinglands, which is a 2-week trip for college students from this country as well as other countries, and Kelly will talk to you about that. But it's a 2-week trip where they travel and learn more and more about different grazing ecosystems and also grazing systems themselves. And this year they went through the southwest part of the United States, and Kelly's going to share with you a little bit of the experience that she and the other students had. So Kelly, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me in the back? Good. All right, so this is the outline of where we took our trip. We started out in Dallas, and sorry the outline of the states isn't very clear, but you can see we zigzagged all around Texas. So we saw eastern Texas, where they actually got a good amount of rainfall and where they were using a lot of grasses that we're familiar with in the east. We talked about Bermuda grass a lot. And then we transitioned over to the central part of the state and all the way over to the western part of the state. And especially there, they were getting really low amounts of rainfall. So the landscape was completely different from something we've been seeing in the eastern part of the United States. We made it all the way up through New Mexico and then traveled up through the mountains and into the plains of Colorado. So before we started out, we decided that we were going to try to save money. So we rented a van and drove to Dallas. So it was about 16 hours. We did it over 2 days, stayed in Alabama, I believe. And then once we got to Dallas, we realized we didn't know what hotel we were staying at. So there's 3 Super 8s in Dallas, and we got to see every single one of them. So it was a great start to the trip. So as mentioned earlier, we represented, there's a typo in there, it's not 78 universities, it's 8. So we went everywhere from mostly the eastern part of the United States, Kentucky, Virginia, NC State, Tennessee, and then we had about 7 different countries that were represented. All the students were at American universities, but some of the students were from different countries. So one of the the jokes that kids from Texas like to say whenever we introduced ourselves is that, these are all the countries that we're from. We're from Senegal, Bhutan, Vietnam, China, Mexico, and then say, and Texas, because they like to think of themselves as their own country sometimes. So the first day of our trip, we got to see these goofy-looking cows. And so I had never seen one before. These are Brahmins, and they're specifically adapted to the southern hot climates that we were seeing in Texas, and they've got these droopy ears, and all that extra skin helps them dissipate a lot of heat. And they're supposedly a lot of insect tolerance, which we don't see as much in Virginia. So they're really adapted to their systems, and it was great to see an animal that's working for them. And they weren't as hot as our black-hided Angus, so it was nice to see that these guys were out grazing in the sunshine, not a care in the world. They were doing really well. Uh-oh.
Top buttons. Let me see for a second.
Oh, thank you. All right, so this is the same place that we saw those cows. They were demonstrating to us different ways that they could corral and trap the feral hogs, because that's a big problem in Texas, especially since the hogs were eating out of their corn feeders for the deer. And the deer are a primary source of income because a lot of ranches down there they do hunting tours, and so it's a big part of their revenue. So this is called a corral trap, and what they do is they have a big group of pigs that is baited, and they walk in there end to end, and then there's a sensor at the other end of the trap. And so once that lead pig gets all the way down to the end of the trap, those doors shut, and they're able to corral in that entire set of pigs. So it's a good way to, instead of just shooting one pig at a time, they can corral a whole family of pigs. And so it works out for them pretty well. The second day, we went to 2 different dairies, and I'm from a dairy farm in Wisconsin, so this was a really fun day for me. The first dairy was a landowner who, they had traditionally started as a conventional dairy farm, feeding silage and things like that. And they eventually switched over to a grazing dairy, and then they also made specialty artisan cheeses. And so the vat that you see right here is really tiny. It's like a large bathtub. That's about the size of it. So they're making very small batches of cheese at a time, but they were really profitable because they had an on-farm store, and they are able to interact with their customers on a daily basis, and they do really well at it. The picture out here, that's a in-ground cold storage facility. So it's a little cave, they call it the cave. And so that's where they age all of their cheeses. It's pretty ambient temperature, probably around 57 degrees, kind of like what we see in caves in this part of the world, or in West Virginia. And then the picture down here was at Tarleton State University. They had a state-of-the-art dairy parlor, and this was actually a rotating platform where the cows get on, they get the milker put on, and then as they spin around counterclockwise, the milker gets taken off at the other side. So for me, that was really neat to see because my family has a traditional stanchion barn, so something of this magnitude is pretty cool to see. Third day, we toured a couple different ranches, and this one was really interesting because they not only had cattle, they had sheep and goats. And these guys down here, you think they're sheep, but they're actually goats. Those are Angora goats, and so they were using the wool from these goats to make really high-quality wool that they were selling to their customers. And then we also, that day, got a demonstration of their herding dog. So they pushed all those goats up into the barn, so it was really cool to see a demonstration like that. We moved over farther into Texas, and this was at the Sonora University on the same day. Here we talked about different ways to manage their pronghorns. So as you can see, we talked about many, many different things on this tour, not only grazing, but also conservation and water use and things like that. And just throughout the presentation, you'll see a couple little wildlife that we saw on the tour. The next day, we were at Sonora Station, so this is getting pretty far west in Texas. And this slide specifically is showing their fire regimes. This site is on a 5-year fire rotation, so every 5 years they're sending a fire through it. And there's different sites along a road that we took, and each of them were at different fire frequencies. So we had 5, 8, and 13 and 20-year fire frequencies. And you could visually see the reduction in trees in the 5-year fire site. I know you can see some in the background, but believe me, the 13-year fire site and the no fire, it was just covered in juniper and mesquite, and those are the 2 trees that they're mostly worried about invading their rangelands. We're moving into New Mexico, so even more dry. These are also special cows that are adapted to New Mexico. These are criollo cows, and they're, like the Brahmins, they're very heat resistant. But if you look, what are they eating? There's no grass here. So they were having 1 cow per 20,000 acres. It's ridiculous. So just the landscape there and seeing how the climate is changing and how it's dictating their grazing systems was really neat to see as we went throughout the tour. Oh yeah, and that's a millipede that we saw up there. I'm really glad we don't have these in this part of the world, because that thing was about 6 inches long. We were moving up into Colorado, and this is the James Ranch. This is a really beautiful family-owned ranch that we got to see. These are their beef cows that are, they're rotationally grazing them in like a floodplain of a river valley. And so this is right next to their house and their homestead, so they have a really pretty view outside. Not only do they have beef, they've got cows and chickens and goats, and I believe they had a little greenhouse business. And so the owner of the ranch, of course we talked about his grazing operation, but one thing he stressed was transitioning into the next generation. So he started with his herd of cows, and when his kids came back from college, if they wanted to help work on the ranch, he said, you're not getting into the cow business. You're going to bring your own business, and then it's going to expand on the family operation. So his daughter brought in the plants. I believe his son brought in the dairy cows. So they just really expanded their operation to include the rest of their family, which was nice to learn about. Here's their dairy cows. Like I said, all pasture, so they had a little milking parlor, and I think they had about 30 dairy cows. These guys are Jerseys or Jersey crosses, and they said they really do well in that environment. So the same day at the ranch, we camped near this pond. They called it the Mosquito Pond, not because there's mosquitoes there, because they're completely void of mosquitoes. That's what they claimed. But I'm pretty sure every one of us on the tour found at least one mosquito. But the view was worth it, well worth it. And then, as I said, they had a very diverse operation. So these pigs were our neighbors next to our campsite. And I don't know how they could even see because their ears completely covered their eyes, but they were characters for sure. All right, so the next day, still in Colorado. If anyone's heard of the Great Sand Dunes National Park, we got to visit it. It's really neat. The way they were formed is that the prevailing winds picked up all that sand and deposited it right on the mountain, right at the base of the mountains, because there was nowhere else for it to go. So it's a really neat formation, and we had a fun time hiking around. Not a great calf workout, but it was a lot of fun. The same day, this was actually right near the dunes, so they had real sandy soil. This farmer was growing alfalfa and potatoes. And so in this area, they have 7 inches of rainfall a year, and that's why it's under irrigation. But the big problem is that the water that they're taking eventually goes downstream to New Mexico and Texas and Mexico. And so in order to avoid a lawsuit, they have to self-regulate themselves on their water usage, and they're saying that's proving to be pretty difficult because no one wants to give up their water rights. And so this farmer, what he was doing in particular, he was trying crop rotations of different things that are going to be as profitable, but not having to require as much water as the potatoes and alfalfa that he was growing. So he was trying to do some progressive things, which is really great. But it did prompt a conversation in our group, because every night when we would convene, we'd have a discussion about what did we learn today, what did we see, what did we like, what did we dislike, what do we think they can improve. The big topic for the day here was, should they even be doing row crops at all with that minimum number of rainfall? So it was a pretty hot debate, which a lot of our nights were, so it was neat. This is a pretty cool day, because this day we focus more on wildlife. So this is a site at the Wagner Ranch in Colorado, and it had been previously disturbed by mining, and so the soils were just horrible. They had very low pH, a lot of nutrient toxicities. And so a company came in and they added a ton of compost to the soil, and they planted some native plants here, and they restored the stream. And so the goal was to improve it for trout habitat and also wildlife and the rest of the grazing lands around it. But they said no trout were introduced, but they did a survey, and more native trout were there than previously before the restoration. So they know that the breeding stock is rebounding just based on what they have done. So it's good for them economically and ecologically. Oh, and the reason I don't have a picture of the Zapata Ranch is they're known for their buffalo. But of course, we went there and we got to hear about their grazing strategy and their land management, but we didn't get to see a single buffalo because they were at a different part of the ranch. So that's why I have nothing for them. We're getting towards the end. We went to a spot in the U.S. Forest Service, and here people are actually grazing up in these alpine forests. So they get different permits, and basically they have to follow some guidelines. And if they're bad, they get kicked out of the program. So we were hearing horror stories about different people who've gotten kicked out for, just letting their cows go wherever, or, just different things that you don't think people still do, but apparently they do. And so the different problems that we were hearing about out in the West was really interesting, because a lot of them we don't have here in the eastern part of the United States. This was another one of my favorite days. We got to go through Rocky Mountain National Park, and we were supposed to meet with one of the park rangers and talk about the land management in the alpine tundra system. Because as you can see, actually you can't see, sorry. But if you look at the mountains on the far side, there's a clear line of where the trees stop. And so in the foreground, we're above that tree line, and that's what they call the alpine tundra. The grasses are very, very short, and it's pretty cold up there. We were here in the heat of the summer, and it was maybe 60 degrees and very, very windy. So not a lot grows up there, and they were talking about different ways that we could manage a system like this. The last day that we had our tour, we hit a few different stops. This was the National Seed Storage Facility. These are the big tanks that they hold all the different seeds and plant tissues in. So they had rows of these things. And as you can imagine, they've got thousands upon thousands of different seeds that are stored here in case of some sort of disaster. We also went to the National Ferret Research Laboratory, and this was a really lucky shot because ferrets are nocturnal, and we were there in the middle of the day. So this girl is one of their ferrets that is almost ready to be reintroduced into the wild. They need to go into boot camp, which is in exclosures outside. And so they put prairie dogs in these systems so the ferrets actually learn to hunt their real live prey. And this guy was also lucky because he's supposed to be sleeping at this time of the day, but he came out and greeted us. So it was really neat to see an animal that's on the endangered species list. And they're being reintroduced throughout Wyoming and Colorado and different parts of the West. And so our last stop of the trip was in Boulder, Colorado at a research station. This is actually one of the really, really neat places that we stopped because it kind of wraps everything together. We had some really great discussions. Specifically at this station, they talked about differences between high, medium, and low stocking densities. And I don't have a great picture of it, but you could see the paddocks side by side, which ones were more impacted by the grazing densities. And they had actually seen that the medium stocking density was about pretty ideal for their typical system here. And so that's about all I have. I don't know how much time I have left. Probably getting pretty close.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
Any questions for Kelly?
I recommend the trip to any other graduate students. I don't know if there's any in here, but I wanted to thank our VFGC for sponsoring part of the trip. It was a really great learning opportunity.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.